The soaring spires of Xanthias glimmered like frozen flames under the light of Seraphine's 3 suns. Each tower, carved from translucent stone, housed the planet's elite. A society so advanced they hadn't known hunger, war, or disease in millennia. Yet, for all their enlightenment, the Seraphinians lived by a rigid code of traditions and expectations, a structure as unyielding as the crystalline structures they called home. Lysara tugged at the collar of her ceremonial gown as she stood in front of her floor-to-ceiling window. Her reflection, framed by strands of silvery hair and shimmering fabrics, seemed almost to sneer back at her. Today marked her 23rd year, an occasion celebrated as the dawn of adulthood on Seraphine. While others in her family anticipated her stepping into her role as an emissary in training, Lysara felt only the weight of what was to come. This was a life charted long before she had a say in it, and though it was the life she'd been born into, she couldn't shake the feeling of being a passenger rather than the captain. Lysara. Her father's voice called from the adjoining chamber, deep and sonorous as ever. The delegates will arrive soon. You're expected in the grand hall within the hour. Yes, father, she replied automatically, not moving from her spot. She let her fingers trail across the cool surface of the window, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Beyond the gleaming city lay untamed plains of violet grasses, undisturbed forests, and mountains that caught the sun like precious gemstones. Out there, at least, was a place where rules gave way to possibility. Daydreaming again? Her brother Kale's voice startled her, and she turned to see him leaning casually against the doorway. You'll be late. I'm never late, Lysara said, though a faint smile softened her words. I just prefer to take my time. Kale chuckled and crossed the room to join her by the window. He was a few years older, his build stronger, his presence more commanding. Where Lysara often felt lost in the expectations placed upon her, Kale had thrived. Yet he never seemed to judge her struggle. You can't keep putting it off, he said. The humans are already here. Didn't you hear the landing signal? Not even a knock, and you're already giving orders, Lysara teased. But Kale caught the nervous undertone in her voice. You'll be fine, he said. You always are. You sound like father, she shot back. But Kale just laughed and ruffled her hair before stepping away. Get ready. I'll meet you down there. The grand hall buzzed with activity as Lysara arrived. Her parents stood near the entrance, flanked by dignitaries who greeted them with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. Servants moved between clusters of guests, their hands steady as they carried trays of delicacies and sparkling beverages. On the far end, near the dais where her father would soon deliver his welcoming speech, stood the human delegation. Even at a distance, they were unmistakable, taller, broader, and darker-skinned than most Seraphinians, with hair that ranged from rich auburn to jet black. They wore sleek uniforms that managed to be both practical and ceremonial, the insignias on their sleeves shimmering faintly in the crystal light. Lysara spotted her brother among the dignitaries and made her way toward him. Kale had always been the steady one, and his presence grounded her. As she approached, a man turned from the human delegation and caught her gaze. He was taller than Kale, his posture easy yet self-assured. His dark hair was swept back, revealing sharp, intelligent features and a set of striking blue eyes that seemed to study everything at once. For a moment, Lysara felt her feet falter. Lysara, Kale said, snapping her attention back. Come, meet our guests. This is Alex Carter, representative of the Terran Federation. The man extended a hand, a human greeting Lysara knew of but had never practiced. It's an honor to meet you, Alex said, his voice warm and confident. Lysara hesitated only a second before grasping his hand. The sensation was strange. His hand was warmer, his skin more textured than hers. Welcome to Seraphine, she said. Kale continued the introductions, gesturing to others from the human delegation and explaining their roles. But Lysara's focus kept drifting back to Alex. His demeanor was unlike anyone she'd met before, so at ease in a room full of alien faces. He asked questions, real questions about Seraphinian culture, their architecture, their technology. It wasn't the usual polite curiosity she was used to. It felt genuine. When Kale was called away by another dignitary, Lysara found herself alone with Alex. He turned to her with a smile. It must be strange for you, seeing us here. I imagine you've met very few humans before. None, actually, she admitted. Only in recordings. Well, I'll try not to disappoint, Alex said, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. This city of yours, Xanthias, is remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like it. It must feel like living in a work of art. It's beautiful, yes, Lysara said, her tone measured. But it can also be confining. Alex tilted his head. How so? Lysara hesitated. She didn't know why, but she felt an urge to be honest with him. There's a path set out for each of us, a role we're expected to fulfill. I've known my purpose since I was a child. Sometimes I wonder if that's all I'll ever be, the role, not the person. Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. That sounds difficult. We have traditions, too, but they're not so rigid. On Earth, it's more common to forge your own path, even if it means making mistakes. The idea was startling, yet oddly appealing. That must be freeing. It can be, Alex said, but it can also be terrifying. Freedom means taking responsibility for what you choose, for the consequences that follow. Still, I think it's worth it. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the hall fading into the background. Lysara felt a strange flutter in her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite place. She'd just met him, and yet his words had sparked something. An idea, a possibility she'd never considered. Before she could reply, her father's voice rang out across the hall, calling everyone to attention. The formal welcome was beginning, and Lysara would have to play her part. But as she moved toward the dais, she glanced back at Alex and found him watching her, a curious light in his eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt that something might change. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The day after the humans' arrival, Xanthias was already brimming with talk of their first formal discussions. Alex had spent the morning immersed in meetings and exchanges, but by the time the suns were high in the sky, he was eager to explore the city itself. Kale, are you free for a bit? Alex asked as the group broke for lunch. Kale, who had been speaking with another diplomat, turned to him and gave a nod. What's on your mind? I was hoping to see more of Xanthias. It's one thing to view it from the Grand Hall, but I'd like to understand how it works, how people actually live here. Kale crossed his arms, considering for a moment. I could show you a few places, but don't expect anything too informal. Even in the lower districts, Seraphinians tend to keep their lives rather structured. That's what I'm curious about, Alex said. How a society can stay so orderly, so predictable? Kale interjected, a wry smile forming. You're not the first outsider to wonder. They set off together, walking through the main thoroughfares of Xanthias. The streets were lined with arched walkways that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Crystalline trees cast soft, prismatic shadows, and everywhere, citizens moved with a calm, measured pace. Alex couldn't help but compare it to the bustling streets of Earth's largest cities, where the unpredictable energy of millions created an entirely different rhythm. What's it like for you? Alex asked as they strolled past a fountain that sparkled with cascading light. Living in a place where everyone seems to know their role? Kale shrugged, his hands resting easily at his sides. For most Seraphinians, it's comforting. Everyone understands what's expected of them, what their contribution is. But that doesn't mean there aren't those who feel restless. He glanced at Alex as if gauging his reaction. My sister, for example, Lysara. Alex's interest sharpened. Restless how? She's never said it outright, but I know her well enough to see it. She's curious about the world beyond Seraphine, about other ways of life. Kale's smile turned faintly amused. I think that's why she seemed so interested in you. Alex chuckled. I'm not sure I'd call it interest. She seemed polite. Kale laughed. Polite is the default here. Interest, however subtle, stands out. You'll see. They continued on, eventually reaching a plaza where holographic projections displayed the city's upcoming events and cultural exhibitions. A crowd had gathered to watch a new performance being advertised, an aerial dance that would take place that evening. The dancers, who appeared as shimmering silhouettes in the holograms, moved with a grace that made Alex stop and stare. Kale leaned against a pillar, watching Alex. "What do you think?" "Beautiful," Alex said, genuinely impressed. "The way they move, it's like they're part of the city itself." "In a way they are," Kale said. "Art here isn't just for expression. It's part of the larger system. It reinforces our values, our identity. Even entertainment has a purpose." Alex turned to him, curiosity evident. "But doesn't that get stifling? When everything has a purpose, doesn't it feel like there's no room for just being?" Kale considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a trade-off. Some find it comforting, knowing everything they do contributes to a greater whole. Others, like Lasara, find it limiting. I suppose that's where we differ from humans. You seem to thrive on the unexpected." "Sometimes," Alex said, grinning. "But too much unpredictability, and things fall apart." Kale's expression softened. "Perhaps. But from what I understand, that chaos can also lead to innovation, to things we Seraphinians might never consider. That's why we're here, after all, to learn what we can from one another." The conversation left Alex with much to think about as they made their way back toward the Grand Hall. Along the way, Kale stopped at a street vendor who sold crystal-infused beverages that glowed faintly in their cups. "Try one," Kale said, handing a drink to Alex. "It's called Ceylon, a blend of purified minerals and fruit essence. Very traditional." Alex took a sip, surprised by the drink's refreshing, slightly tart flavor. "That's incredible. I've never tasted anything like it." Kale smiled. "It's a favorite here. My sister would always steal these when we were kids. She was never one for following the rules." Alex laughed. "I'm beginning to see a pattern with her." Kale's voice grew more serious. "She may not always say it, but Lasara is drawn to the unknown. People like you who think differently. She finds that fascinating." Alex nodded, the taste of the Ceylon lingering on his tongue as he thought about Lasara's quick, curious eyes. "I'd like to understand her better, to understand all of this better." Kale's smile returned, though it held a trace of something deeper. "Then you'd better be ready for more questions. She has plenty." Chapter 3, Forbidden Interests. The days that followed brought a mix of formal meetings and informal explorations. Kale often accompanied Alex through Xanthias, showing him parts of the city that even most Seraphinians considered remote. Beneath the dazzling facade of the crystalline towers, there were districts where tradition still ruled, untouched by modern innovation. They found themselves in one of these older quarters, walking along narrow pathways lined with ancient carvings. The air here felt cooler, and the light from the suns filtered through intricately etched panels, creating a kaleidoscope of color that danced on the ground. "It's hard to believe this place has stood for millennia," Alex said, his gaze sweeping over the architecture. On Earth, most ancient structures are ruins, barely held together by preservation efforts. Kale gave a faint smile. "Seraphinians have always been meticulous. We value continuity, ensuring that what came before is not just remembered, but maintained. Though some would argue we do so at the expense of progress." "Some, meaning your sister?" Alex asked with a knowing glance. Kale laughed softly. "Lasara doesn't quite see it that way. She's proud of her heritage. She just thinks there's more to learn by looking outward than inward." "Sounds like she's not alone," Alex said, nodding toward the clusters of younger Seraphinians they passed. Many wore less traditional attire, their clothing incorporating sleek fabrics and designs that seemed influenced by other worlds. "Change is slow," Kale admitted, "but it happens. It's just that our people prefer evolution over revolution." The two men stopped in a shaded courtyard where a small fountain bubbled softly. Alex sat on the low edge of the fountain, resting his hands on his knees. "It must be strange," he said, "to have everything so set. On Earth, we're used to constant disruption, new technologies, shifting alliances, cultural fads that rise and fall in months." Kale leaned against a nearby column, crossing his arms. It can be comforting knowing what to expect, but I can see how it might also be confining. I wonder if that's why Lysara and I keep ending up in these long conversations, Alex said with a chuckle. She seems interested in everything I say, even the most mundane details about human life. It's like she's trying to imagine what it would be like to live differently. Kale studied him for a moment, then nodded. She's always been curious, and you've got a way of explaining things that makes them sound appealing. Alex shrugged. I think it's just that we see the world differently. That perspective is what keeps me wanting to talk to her, too. Before Kale could reply, a soft, musical chime echoed through the courtyard. Alex turned to see Lysara stepping into view. She wore a simple, flowing garment rather than her formal diplomatic robes. Her silver hair was unbound, catching the light like liquid metal. She paused when she noticed them, then walked over with a calm, graceful stride. Kale, she said, a faint smile on her lips. I thought you were busy today. Diplomacy can wait, Kale replied. Alex wanted to see more of Xanthias, so I thought I'd show him around. Lysara's eyes flicked to Alex, her smile growing slightly. You've chosen well. This district is one of the most beautiful parts of the city. It's incredible, Alex said, rising to his feet. I've never seen anything like it. The three of them walked together, Lysara now guiding them to a nearby market. The stalls were modest, offering handcrafted items, vibrant textiles, and aromatic teas. The vendors greeted Lysara with polite nods, clearly recognizing her but treating her no differently than any other customer. As they moved through the market, Alex found himself talking more with Lysara, their dialogue easy and natural. They discussed everything from the subtle differences in their languages to the ways humans and Seraphinians prepared meals. Kale, meanwhile, stayed slightly behind, observing quietly. He seemed content to let the two of them connect, offering only the occasional comment or nod of agreement. When they stopped at a stall selling intricate jewelry, Lysara picked up a delicate chain adorned with a small crystal pendant. This is made from a mineral found deep beneath the city, she explained. It's said to bring clarity of thought. Alex tilted his head. Do you believe that? She laughed lightly. Not really, but it's a nice sentiment. Kale glanced at the horizon. It's getting late. We should head back to the hall. Lysara hesitated, then handed the pendant to the vendor. I'll take this. After paying, she turned and placed the chain in Alex's hand. A souvenir of Xanthias, she said. Alex looked at her in surprise, then smiled. Thank you. I'll treasure it. As they made their way back toward the grand hall, the atmosphere between them felt different. Alex and Lysara walked side by side, their conversations flowing naturally while Kale strolled a few paces ahead, giving them space. For the first time, Alex began to feel that his presence here wasn't just about politics or treaties. It was about understanding a way of life so different from his own and maybe, just maybe, helping someone else see things a little differently too. Chapter 4, Closer Encounters. The first evening after the negotiations ended, Alex sat in the quiet garden of the embassy compound, surrounded by the faint hum of crystalline flora. Seraphinian plants glowed faintly, their natural phosphorescence casting soft, shifting colors over the walls and pathways. It was a rare moment of peace, and he felt no rush to leave it. His thoughts drifted back to the day's conversations and to the way Lysara's expression would soften when she found a topic particularly interesting. Am I interrupting? A familiar voice asked. Alex looked up to see Kale, who approached holding 2 delicate glasses of Ceylon. Not at all, Alex said, gesturing for him to sit. I was just enjoying the quiet. Kale handed Alex one of the glasses and lowered himself onto the stone bench beside him. He took a sip before speaking. Lysara mentioned that she and you had another long talk today. She's not usually this open with outsiders. I'm not sure I'd call it open, Alex replied with a small laugh. More like curious. She asks a lot of questions about Earth, about how we think, what we value. It's like she's piecing together a puzzle. Kale leaned back, cradling the glass in his hands. That's her way, always searching for the parts that don't quite fit into the picture we're given. Alex thought about this for a moment. You're protective of her, aren't you? Kale's gaze stayed steady. We've always looked out for each other. She may seem poised and composed, but Lysara's always been sensitive. She feels things deeply, even if she doesn't show it. I think she feels that she doesn't belong in this world of rules and tradition, Alex said. It's like she's trying to find her own place, but she doesn't know how. Kale nodded slowly. You're perceptive. That's probably why she feels comfortable around you. Alex didn't reply immediately. He stared into his glass, watching the faint glow of the Ceylon. I just want to understand her better. Maybe even help if I can. Kale tilted his head, studying Alex's expression. You really mean that, don't you? I do, Alex said simply. But it's not just about her. It's also about understanding your culture, seeing how your people live and what drives them, what matters to them. I think there's so much we can learn from each other. Kale's expression softened, a hint of respect showing in his eyes. Lysara might not say it, but I think she's glad you're here, even if it's just to have someone who doesn't see her as just a diplomat. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the faint rustling of crystalline leaves and the distant murmur of the city beyond the embassy's walls. Finally, Kale stood, brushing off his tunic. You'll find her in the North Garden. She likes to sit by tea. Elected his thoughts, and followed the winding path that led to the North Garden. He spotted Lysara almost immediately. She was sitting cross-legged on a low stone platform, gazing out over the reflecting pool. The water's surface mirrored the brilliant lights of the crystalline plants, creating an illusion of infinite depth. She didn't look up as he approached, but her voice carried softly to him. I thought you might come. Alex stopped a few paces away. Kale mentioned you might be here. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile playing at her lips. He always knows where to find me. I guess that's what older brothers do, Alex said, stepping closer. They keep an eye out. Lysara turned back to the pool. Kale and I have always been close, but even he doesn't always understand what I'm looking for. Maybe because you're looking for something no one's found yet, Alex suggested, sitting down beside her. Something new. She gave a quiet laugh. And what would a human diplomat know about that? I know what it feels like to want more, Alex said. More than what's expected of you. More than just following the path someone else laid out. Lysara's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. I've felt that way for as long as I can remember. I see the beauty in our traditions, but I also feel stifled, as if I can't breathe deeply. That's why I think you're so drawn to Earth, Alex said gently. Not because it's better or worse than Seraphine, but because it's different. It offers perspectives you haven't seen before. Lysara nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the pool. And yet, every step I take toward the unknown, I feel the weight of my family's expectations pulling me back. Then let's take it one step at a time, Alex said. You don't have to change everything at once. Just explore. See where it leads. She turned to him, her silver eyes searching his face. And you'd help me do that? If you want me to, he replied without hesitation. For a long moment, neither spoke. The soft glow of the garden surrounded them, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of water. When Lysara finally reached out and placed her hand lightly on Alex's, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the climate. Thank you, she said quietly. Alex gave her hand a small squeeze. We'll figure it out. Together. Chapter 5 Cultural Ripples. The warm light of Seraphine's 3 suns filled the expansive chamber, creating dazzling patterns on the crystal walls. Alex sat at a long, polished table alongside several Seraphinian officials and human delegates. Their meeting had been going on for hours, filled with formal presentations, polite debates, and the occasional quiet exchange between Lysara and her father at the head of the table. Kale, seated beside Alex, leaned slightly toward him and murmured under his breath, "Don't fall asleep on us. The third item on the agenda should be marginally less dull." "I'm doing my best," Alex whispered back, offering a faint grin. "It's just a lot of talking in circles." Kale chuckled quietly, then leaned back as the Seraphinian dignitary at the front continued to discuss interplanetary trade protocols. Alex's thoughts drifted, not entirely following the nuances of the discussion. Instead, his focus kept returning to the recent conversations he'd had with Lysara, the moments of quiet honesty they had shared. Something about those interactions felt different, significant. When the session finally adjourned, The delegates filtered out of the chamber in small groups, exchanging pleasantries. Alex stretched his shoulders and turned to Kale. What's next? More meetings. Not for a while, Kale said. They've scheduled a formal reception this evening. But until then, you're free to explore. He gave Alex a knowing smile. You might find someone else exploring the gardens, too. Alex raised an eyebrow, then laughed softly. Thanks for the tip. Kale clapped him on the back before heading off, leaving Alex standing in the grand hall. He lingered for a moment, then made his way toward the lush gardens outside the compound. The scent of blooming flowers filled the air as he followed a winding path toward the reflecting pool. As he approached, he spotted Lasara sitting on the same low platform where they had spoken the previous evening. This time, her attention was focused on a small holographic projector in her lap, its image flickering faintly in the sunlight. You're making a habit of this? Alex said as he approached. Lasara glanced up, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. So are you. He lowered himself onto the platform beside her, looking curiously at the projection. It displayed a series of intricate designs, interlocking patterns of light and geometry. What's that? Cultural mosaics, she said. Each design represents a different part of Seraphinian heritage, regions, traditions, historical events. I've been studying them since I was a child. They're beautiful, Alex said, like visual stories. Exactly, Lasara said, her voice softening, but they're also a way of keeping our history alive. Every pattern has meaning, and every Seraphinian is expected to understand them. And you know them all? Alex asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. Most of them. Some are rare, only seen in the farthest regions of the planet. But I've always wanted to learn more. Alex leaned forward, his curiosity genuine. How do you learn about the ones you haven't seen? Usually through records or instruction from elders, she said. But sometimes, if you're fortunate, someone who has traveled far might share their knowledge. That sounds structured, Alex said, choosing his words carefully. On Earth, a lot of our cultural traditions are passed down informally. Sometimes it's just stories told at family gatherings or a random discovery in a library. Lasara's smile grew slightly. I like that idea. It sounds more spontaneous. Seraphinian culture is so focused on preservation that we often lose that sense of discovery. Alex watched her closely, sensing the deeper longing behind her words. Maybe that's what draws you to Earth. It's not just the differences. It's the chance to find something unexpected. She glanced at him, her silver eyes searching his face. And what about you? What do you find unexpected here? Alex thought for a moment, then said, the stillness. Back home, everything moves so fast. People rush from one thing to another, always chasing the next big breakthrough or change. Here it's quieter, more deliberate. And do you like that? She asked. He nodded. I think I do. It's nice to slow down, to actually see things. But it also makes me appreciate the chaos back home. It's a reminder that both ways of life have their own beauty. Lasara tilted her head, considering his answer. You're different from what I expected. When I first heard humans were coming, I imagined people who would be loud, brash, always demanding more. But you're not like that. Alex smiled faintly. Humans come in all shapes, sizes, and personalities. Some of us are loud. Some are quiet. I think the real challenge is understanding each other's perspectives. She nodded slowly, then turned her gaze back to the mosaics. I wonder if Seraphine could ever be more open to that kind of understanding. Our people value order so much that we rarely take risks. But maybe we should. Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out to touch the edge of the holographic projection. The light flickered around his hand, creating a pattern of refracted colors. Sometimes, he said, the best way to understand something new is to let it touch you, to let it change you, even just a little. Lasara watched him, her expression unreadable. And if it changes too much, then you learn to adapt, Alex said simply. That's what humans do. That's what I think anyone can do. For a moment, they sat in silence, the garden's gentle sounds filling the space between them. Then Lysara reached over and placed her hand lightly over Alex's, her touch warm and steady. He looked at her, surprised, but she met his gaze with a quiet confidence. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to take a risk." Chapter 6. The Confrontation. As the final round of diplomatic discussions began, Alex felt a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The Seraphinians and the human delegates had reached what appeared to be an impasse, and both sides were growing restless. Alex stood near the edge of the grand hall, scanning the room for Kale. He didn't have to wait long before Kale appeared at his side, his brow furrowed. "Something's not right," Kale said in a low voice, not looking directly at Alex. "There's a new group of advisors influencing the senior council, and they're pushing hard against the agreements we've been working toward." "I noticed," Alex replied. "They barely even listened to the last proposal." "What's changed?" Kale folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Politics. Power plays. Certain factions think that associating too closely with humans could weaken our traditions. They're using the relationship between you and Lysara as a pretext to create division." Alex stiffened. "Lysara and I haven't done anything inappropriate. We've talked. We've shared ideas. How can that be seen as a threat?" Kale sighed. "It's not about logic. It's about appearances. They're using fear, claiming that your presence is influencing her judgment and, by extension, the council's decisions. They want to force her into a position where she either denounces you or steps away from her role entirely." Alex frowned, glancing across the room. He spotted Lysara standing with a group of dignitaries, her face calm but her posture tense. He could tell she'd heard the whispers, the subtle criticisms cloaked in formality. "This isn't fair to her," Alex said. "She's one of the most thoughtful, intelligent people I've ever met. She's doing what she thinks is best for everyone, not just for me." "I know," Kale said, "but fairness isn't what drives these people. They see an opportunity to tighten their control and they're taking it. The question is what we do now." Alex took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need to confront them directly, not angrily but openly. If they're making these accusations, they should be willing to back them up. Maybe if we address it head-on, we can cut off the rumors before they spread further." Kale considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I'll talk to my father. He still holds enough influence that his voice can steady the council. But you'll need to be ready to speak up, too. If they call you out, you'll have to explain your intentions clearly." "I'm ready," Alex said. "I just hope Lysara is too." Kale glanced toward his sister, his expression softening. "She's stronger than she seems. But even the strongest need someone to stand beside them." That evening, the council convened in a more formal setting than before. The room was larger, with tiered seating that allowed each member a clear view of the speakers. The light from the crystalline chandeliers above cast a brilliant glow, making every movement, every expression visible. Alex sat near the front, beside Kale, waiting for the meeting to begin. When the senior council members filed in, it was clear they were divided. Some greeted Lysara with respect, while others avoided her gaze entirely. Her father, a towering figure of authority, took his place at the head of the room. Once everyone was seated, he stood and addressed the gathering. "We have heard concerns from certain members of our council regarding the conduct of our delegation and our guests from the Terran Federation," he began. His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable gravity to his words. "As we proceed, let us remember that our goal is understanding and cooperation, not division." One of the dissenting advisors, a stern-faced man named Talrin, rose from his seat. "It is precisely in the name of understanding that we must discuss the undue influence certain parties have had on our decisions. The interactions between our delegate, Lysara, and the human envoy have raised questions. Questions about impartiality, about whether our agreements are being shaped by personal affections rather than rational discourse." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Alex felt his jaw tighten, but before he could speak, Lysara stood. Her posture was calm, but her voice carried a quiet strength. "Talrin, she said. If you have specific concerns about my conduct, I invite you to state them plainly. Talrin hesitated, then said, You have spent considerable time alone with the human envoy. Your decisions have increasingly favored their proposals. How are we to know that your actions have not been influenced by a personal attachment? Lysara's silver eyes met his unflinchingly. My decisions are based on what I believe will benefit both our people and theirs. I have listened to their perspectives, just as I have listened to ours. To imply that I am incapable of professional judgment is to question not only my integrity, but the integrity of our entire process. She turned to the rest of the council, her voice steady. If anyone here believes that I have acted improperly, I ask them to speak now. If not, then let us put this matter to rest and focus on the work at hand. The chamber fell silent. Talrin opened his mouth as if to reply, but no words came. Slowly he sat back down. Lysara's father glanced around the room, then spoke. Let it be known that the council finds no grounds for these accusations. We will proceed with our negotiations as planned. As the meeting continued, Alex couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for Lysara. She had faced the accusations head-on and emerged stronger. Beside him, Kale gave a small nod, as if to say, I told you she could handle it. By the time the session adjourned, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The dissenting faction, though not entirely silenced, had lost much of its momentum. Alex walked with Kale toward the main exit, glancing over his shoulder once to see Lysara standing with her father, their voices low but their expressions calm. Looks like you were right, Alex said. She didn't need my help after all. Kale smiled faintly. She didn't do it alone. Sometimes, just knowing someone's in your corner can make all the difference. Alex nodded. Then I'm glad I was here. Chapter 7. A Delicate Alliance. The Grand Assembly Hall was packed with delegates and advisors, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the crystalline chandeliers overhead. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as people murmured quietly, their conversations blending into a low hum. Lysara stood near the center of the room, dressed in formal robes that seemed to shimmer in the warm light. Her brother, Kale, stood a few steps behind her, his presence steadying. Alex watched from one side of the hall, his heart pounding as he prepared for what was about to unfold. Lysara took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room fell silent. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm yet strong enough to carry through the vast space. Distinguished members of the assembly, esteemed guests, I stand before you not only as a representative of Seraphine, but also as someone who has seen firsthand the potential for true understanding between our people and the Terran Federation. There was a brief pause as her words settled over the crowd. She continued, In my time spent with our human guests, I have been challenged to think beyond our traditions, to consider perspectives we have never encountered before. It is not a question of one culture being superior to another, but of the mutual benefits that come from genuine exchange. I believe that we, as a people, must be willing to take risks, not to abandon our heritage, but to enrich it. Alex felt a swell of pride as he listened. He glanced at Kale, who met his eyes and gave a faint nod of approval. Kale had been a constant support throughout the weeks of negotiations, standing by his sister even when the pressure from the more conservative factions grew intense. As Lysara spoke, a few of the more traditionalist council members exchanged skeptical looks. One of them, an elder named Vorin, rose to his feet. Lysara, your words are well spoken, he said, his tone measured. But I must ask, how can we be certain that this partnership will not erode the values that have sustained us for millennia? What assurances do we have that our way of life will remain intact? Lysara nodded, acknowledging the concern. Vorin, I understand your hesitation. Change always brings uncertainty. But maintaining our traditions does not mean isolating ourselves. It means adapting in a way that strengthens who we are. By learning from others, we can find new ways to honor our heritage while preparing for the challenges ahead. Alex leaned toward Kale, whispering, She's handling this well. Kale smirked. Did you expect anything less? A quiet laugh escaped Alex, easing the tension in his chest. He returned his attention to Lasara, who continued to address the assembly. I am not suggesting that we change for the sake of change. I am suggesting that we expand our understanding, that we take the time to learn, to collaborate, and to build something greater than what we could achieve alone. From his place near the edge of the hall, Alex could see the ripple of reactions in the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained stoic. He felt a pull to contribute, to back up Lasara's words with his own experience. At a subtle gesture from Kale, Alex stepped forward. "May I speak?" Alex asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The assembly turned toward him, and Lasara gave a small nod of approval. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, "I come from a world that is vastly different from yours. On Earth, we have learned the hard way that isolation and division lead to stagnation. It is through connecting with others, sharing ideas, and working together that we have overcome our greatest challenges. My people and yours may not be the same, but we share something fundamental: the desire to create a better future. I believe that if we choose cooperation over suspicion, we can find ways to support each other's growth." His words were met with a mix of murmurs and silence. He turned to Lasara, who gave him a faint smile, then continued, "This is not about replacing one way of life with another. It is about opening doors that have been closed for too long. If we approach this partnership with honesty and respect, I believe we can achieve something extraordinary." When Alex stepped back, Lasara resumed her place at the center of attention. "What my colleague from Earth has said is true. This is not about losing what we have. It is about gaining something new, new perspectives, new solutions, and new friends. If we do not seize this opportunity, we risk remaining stagnant while the universe around us moves forward." The room fell into a deep silence as the assembly members exchanged glances. Finally, Vorin spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You make a compelling argument, Lasara. If we are to move forward, it must be with caution and wisdom. I am willing to listen further." Lasara inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Vorin. I look forward to continuing this conversation." As the meeting concluded, Alex found himself standing with Kale in a quiet corner. "I think that went as well as it could have," Alex said. Kale nodded. "You did well out there. So did Lysar." X felt a quiet determination take hold. There was still much to be done, but they were moving in the right direction. Together. Chapter 8. New Horizons. The construction site was bustling with activity. Though the plans for a new cultural exchange center had only just been finalized, the area was already alive with movement. Workers, both human and Seraphinian, moved in unison, setting up scaffolds and arranging shipments of materials. The atmosphere was charged with a rare mixture of excitement and curiosity. It wasn't every day that two civilizations pooled their resources to build something entirely new. Alex stood near the edge of the site, scanning the scene. The towering crystalline structures of Xanthias loomed in the distance, their shimmer softened by the thin haze of dawn. Kale was beside him, his arms crossed as he watched the work unfold. "It's actually happening," Alex said, half to himself. Kale grinned. "Were you expecting it not to?" Alex smirked. "I've learned to keep my expectations grounded. There were moments during negotiations when it felt like everything might fall apart. Yet here you are, watching humans and Seraphinians work together," Kale pointed out. "I'd say that's a sign you've done something right." The two men fell into a comfortable silence, their eyes following a group of workers raising the first support beam. The sleek metal frame glinted in the morning light, its surface etched with intricate Seraphinian designs. Each carving represented a shared story, a melding of human and alien history that would be displayed prominently once the center was complete. "You think this place will actually bring people together?" Alex asked, his voice thoughtful. Kale shrugged. "It's a step. That's all anyone can ask for. People need somewhere to meet, to learn, to see each other as more than just aliens. I think it'll work. Eventually." Alex nodded. He turned slightly, catching sight of Lasara across the site. She was speaking with a group of architects, gesturing toward a set of schematics. She wore a simple, practical outfit, the long lines of her robe replaced by a shorter tunic and fitted trousers. Her silvery hair was tied back, allowing her sharp, intelligent features to stand out more clearly. Cale noticed Alex's gaze and nudged him lightly. Go. She's been looking for you. Alex hesitated for only a moment before walking toward her. Lysara spotted him as he approached, her expression brightening. Alex, she said, I'm glad you're here. Wouldn't miss it, he replied, smiling. How's it going on your end? The plans are coming together, she said, holding up a datapad. The architects are incorporating elements from both cultures, our crystalline structures, your more modular designs. It's actually beautiful. Alex looked at the holographic projection she was showing. The building's facade was a seamless blend of sharp, angular Seraphinian crystal and smooth, flowing human metalwork. It was unlike anything he'd seen before. It really is, he said. Something new, yet familiar. Lysara nodded, her gaze lingering on the design. This place will be more than just a building. It'll be a space for connection. A way for both our peoples to see each other in a different light. Alex glanced at her, noticing the quiet determination in her expression. You've come a long way since that first meeting. She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. So have you. They stood there for a moment, the sounds of construction fading into the background. Alex felt a subtle shift between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. When Lysara stepped closer, he didn't move away. Her hand brushed his, the touch light but deliberate. I think we make a good team, she said softly. Agreed, Alex replied. We might even be onto something great. Lysara's smile widened, and for the first time in weeks, Alex felt a quiet certainty. The past months had been filled with challenges, with difficult conversations and uncomfortable compromises. But standing here, seeing the foundation of something truly collaborative, he knew it had been worth it. Nearby, Cale called out, waving a pair of hard hats in the air. Hey, are you two going to help? Or just stand there looking philosophical? Lysara laughed, her eyes sparkling. Duty calls. Alex grinned and nodded. Let's get to it. Together, they walked toward Cale, ready to jump into the work ahead. As they moved, Alex couldn't help but glance back at the emerging structure. It was only the beginning, but beginnings were often the hardest part. And they'd gotten through that together.